Miss Collier Explains.
Introduction to Algebra.
Today we are doing an introduction to algebra, which mainly focuses on the language we use. Our learning intention today is to know the basic terminology of algebra, to be able to identify coefficients, variables, terms, and constants within an expression, and to be able to write expressions from word descriptions. We will know we have been successful when we can state the coefficient over pronumeral within an expression, when we can list the terms within an expression and identify constant terms, and when we can write algebraic expressions from word descriptions. Algebra may seem like this big scary concept that everyone tells you is really hard, but it's actually not, and you've been doing algebra since you were very small without even realizing it. Now all we're going to do is make it more formal and show you the language so you can understand what you've been doing. So algebra is actually its own language that we use to communicate mathematical ideas, especially when something is unknown. We will start today by learning the language that will help us later. Algebra is used in many areas of life, but it is especially useful to helping us describe patterns. Alright, let's dive into some words we need to learn. The first one is pronumerals. And a pronumeral is a letter that can represent a number. You will have used many examples of this already. Just think about when we found the area of an object. We said A equals length times width. We use letters to replace numbers. They are called pronumerals. The choice of the letter that we use is not actually very important in terms of the mathematics, but often we use letters that are a bit obvious. Like in this example I've told you now, A stands for area, L stands for length, W stands for width. So it kind of makes sense. Maybe we'll use H to represent someone's height, W to represent weight. There's many different ways we can use it. In terms of general algebra, you will see that mathematicians often use X, Y, and Z. You will also see that I've written the X kind of fancy. That is so that we don't confuse the X with the multiplication sign. We can often use algebra to calculate the salary based on the number of hours worked. This table here shows us the salary for Petra depending on the different number of hours she worked if she earns $12 an hour. We can see if she worked 1 hour, she got $12, 2 hours, 24, 3 hours is 36. But you can see here we've created a bit of a formula using algebra to determine how much she would be paid depending on whatever number she worked. And that is 12 times n representing the number of hours she works. So we've learnt the word pronumerals. The next one we need to learn is unknown. Now, the unknown is the actual number that the letter represents. So for instance, we had A equals length times width. The A, the L, and the W are all pronumerals. But if I actually went and measured my desk, I would realize that my length is 160 and my width is 90. So the 160 and the 90 are called unknowns. They're because until I measured it, they were unknown to me. So the actual number that the letter represents is called an unknown. The third word we need to know is the word variable. Now, if we think about the word varied, meaning to change, it makes sense that a variable is a pronumeral when the unknown can change. An example of a variable is the salary we talked about before. Petra earned 12n, which is 12 times the number of hours that she works. This n is a pronumeral because it's a letter that is representing a number, but it is also a variable because that number can change. So each week, Petra might work a different number of hours, and therefore the n will represent a different number each week, meaning it can vary. That's why it's both a pronumeral and a variable. Our next word is term. Now this one is kind of the most confusing. A term consists of numbers and pronumerals that are combined together using multiplication or division. Each term is then combined together using addition or subtraction. I'll give you an example. If I had 12n plus 2z take 1y, I have 3 terms, here, here, and here. So you can see I've got a combination of letters and numbers added, multiplied or divided together, and then each of those are added or subtracted. So it's kind of each of the parts of an expression, they're called terms. And you'll notice I included the sign there. Your sign is included in your terms. So it's actually -1y. Our next word is constant. Now, if you think about what that actually means, constant, not changing, it makes sense that that's a term that never changes. So a term that doesn't have a pronumeral, which means it always stays the same, is a constant. So if I say +9, that's another term in our algebraic expression, but 9 never changes. 9 always represents 9, and so that's why it's constant. So any number by itself is a constant. The next word we need to learn is coefficient. Coefficient. That is the number that sits right in front of a pronumeral. The number the pronumeral is multiplied by. Let's find some here. Here's a pronumeral. Its coefficient is 12. Here's a pronumeral. Its coefficient is 2. Here's a pronumeral. Its coefficient is -1. Notice that the sign is always included in that coefficient. So the number in front of a pronumeral is called a coefficient. And note that it's always written in front. We never write N12. The number always comes first. All right, I now need to introduce you to a concept called invisible math. There are some things that always happen in math, and so therefore we kind of just erase them out because we know that they always happen. But we need to know about them to know that they always exist. There are a number of invisible math rules when it comes to algebra. The first one is that there is a coefficient of 1 to the left of any variable unless there's already a different number there. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's remember, coefficient is the number in front of a letter. And there's always a coefficient of 1 if there's no other number. So basically what that means is if you see x, it's 1x. But we don't have to write the 1 every time, we can just write x. If I have 1y, I don't have to write 1y, I can just write y by itself. And so whenever we see a letter by itself, if I see an m there, if I ask you what's the coefficient of m, you're going to tell me the number 1 because you know that there's an invisible 1 there. Now it's invisible math, so we don't write the 1 there, but we can see that because there's no other number written there, there is only one m. Therefore, it's 1m. So that's invisible math rule number 1 for algebra, but we need to learn another invisible math rule quick now. There is a multiplication sign between every coefficient and variable. What you may have noticed so far is like before, I wrote 12n. Now what that is actually saying is 12 times the number of hours that petrol was working, 12 times n. So this sentence is actually 12 times n. But we don't actually have to write multiplication signs between letters and numbers when we're doing algebra. We just smush them together and then everyone knows that that means multiplication. So if you see 7j, that means 7 times j. If you see 6m, that means 6 times m. There is always an invisible multiplication sign in between pronumerals. That also means if you see m, o, p, y, what it actually is saying is m times o times p times y. Well, why do we do this, you may ask? Well, this is a pretty good example of it. When we look at this right here, that cross means multiply. But because we're doing algebra and there's x's involved, there's suddenly letters in math, some people could get confused about whether or not that's an x or a multiply. So that's one of the reasons we just take the multiplication away, because it kind of gets pretty confusing. The other reason is it's much neater, and because everyone knows it, it's easy to do. I have to just tell you a couple more quick tips. Number 1, in algebra, BODMAS still applies. So if you see brackets, you do them first. Number 2, if we are multiplying more than one letter together, we always write them out in alphabetical order. So if you had an A and you had to multiply it by a B and an M, you would write A, B, M. Even if when you were looking at the question, the M came first, then the B and then the A, or the M, then the A, then the B. We don't write it like that. We always write them in order. That's so later, when we have to group them, it's much easier to figure out if it's all the same. So we always use our alphabetical order. Another thing, when we're doing algebra, we always start from the most complicated on the left through to the simplest on the right. So therefore, let's say an x was being squared, that would come first. Then we have 2z, plain old z by itself. And then we have 7. So squared is pretty complicated, so that's coming first. Then you've got your plain pronumeral, and then you have your constant at the end. If we had maybe m to the power of 3, that would even come before that because it's more complicated. So we always start more complicated on the left, right through to the constants at the end.